The Lost Year, Chapter 2, Loss. The trip between Camelot and Ealdor on foot took 2 days. On horseback, it took a full day. Merlin made it in just over half a day. Her horse was practically foaming at the mouth by the time she made it into the town. The sun was beginning to set. It was something of a miracle that the lead rope, which was all Dancer had in the way of tack at the moment, hadn't caught on something in their mad dash. Merlin left the exhausted horse outside and rushed inside her childhood home. She only got a moment's flash of happiness at the sight of her father kneeling next to her mother's bed. "Father?" Merlin called, and Balinor turned.
"You got my letter,"
he said, relief rushing across his face. Merlin nodded, joining him at her mother's side.
"I wasn't sure you would get here in time,"
he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Her mother lay on the single bed. She was pale, near gaunt, a sheen of sweat clinging to her skin, her breathing ragged. Merlin knew the symptoms. It was a disease she'd seen a few times in the lower town. Most called it sweating sickness, as that tended to be the most prevalent symptom. Merlin glanced at her father. "Is there nothing that can be done?" she asked. Balinor shook his head.
"I've tried everything in my power. There's nothing that can be done. I'm sorry,"
Balinor said, and Merlin felt tears slip down her face. Huneth lasted for 3 more days, only waking once in that time. She was almost completely delirious, but pleased that Merlin was home, that the family was all together for once. They had never been all together before. Merlin sobbed at the thought that they would never all be together again. Uther frowned at his son.
"The steward tells me your maid ran off with one of the horses."
"She didn't steal Dancer. I granted her use of the fastest horse we have," Arthur said. Uther blinked.
"Why would you do that?"
"A servant's business may sometimes require a horse, but never the best we have on hand, Arthur," Uther began. "Her mother is dying." Arthur cut across his father, setting down the note Leon had brought him on the table. "She may not reach her in time even on horseback, but if I can give her a chance to say goodbye to her mother, then I will do everything I can, even if that means just giving her a horse," though she hadn't told him about it beforehand.
"She's just a serving girl,"
Uther tried to insist. "I would give anything to say goodbye to my mother. I will not deny another the chance I never got," Arthur said, glad it was just the two of them in the room. Uther's face dropped into a frown, and he nodded. "Very well," Uther said, dismissing Arthur with a wave. He took up the note and left. On his way back to his chambers, Gwen crossed his path, chewing her lip. "Is it true? Sir Leon says that Merlin left yesterday," Gwen said, and Arthur nodded.
"Her mother is ill,"
Arthur said, frowning at the note in his hand. "She may not have long." Gwen sobbed. "Poor Merlin. Has someone told Gaius? She's his youngest sister," Gwen asked, wiping at her eyes. Arthur frowned.
"I don't know,"
he admitted, and Gwen nodded. "I'll tell him, sire," Gwen assured him, and Arthur nodded. It was near dawn when Huneth drew her last breath and stilled. Neither Balinor or Merlin had slept, and when Merlin took her mother's limp hand in hers, tears came, ripping themselves out of her in a wail that almost seemed to echo. The magic rose unbidden, but there was nothing even Merlin's powers could do. She had already tried. The ground beneath them shook, and stones cracked with the force of the power Merlin released in her grief. Balinor had never seen a display of power like this before, not an unintentional one. His daughter was a force of nature, almost literally. Balinor had spent the last 2 months in Ealdor, having the life he would have had if Uther had not been chasing him, or most of it. Merlin had been missed, but he'd learned more about her, including the odd circumstances of her birth. He'd heard the prophecies of Emrys since he was a child. He'd never put much stock in them, but if Merlin wasn't the subject of that particular prophecy, he would swear off magic for the rest of time. He hadn't been sure until she caused the earthquake. He held her as she sobbed and the world stopped shaking. The funeral was not as small as Balinor expected. The whole town came to say goodbye to Huneth. Many of them had recognized him as Merlin's father already. No one questioned why he'd been gone so long or why he'd been able to return. They burned her body on a small pyre just on the outskirts of town. Merlin sobbed into her father's shoulder. Balinor's heart twisted as the fire burned out. There wasn't a lot in the house. Most of it Merlin and Balinor gave away to the others in the village over the next few days as both of them packed to leave. "Will you stay?" Merlin asked as she packed a small bag of her mother's spare belongings that she was keeping. Balinor shook his head. "There's nothing
There's nothing for me in Ealdor without her. I thought I might seek out the old stronghold of the dragonlords,"
he admitted. Merlin blinked. "That's a real place? I've never heard of it," she said, pulling on her mother's cloak.
"It was. Uther tricked the dragonlords into coming and summoning our dragons. He claimed it was for a celebration, but we found only a slaughter. The fortress of Scathing Dragon has been abandoned for just over 20 years.
He said, and Merlin nodded. There was a knock at the door. It was one of the other women in the village. "Merlin, I know you're meant to be returning to Camelot, but you may want to hold your journey. We've just got word the pass is closed. We think the quake the day your mother died may have caused an avalanche," she said, leaning in the doorway. Merlin swore. "Thanks for letting me know, Bee," she said, setting down her pack. Bee nodded, regarded Balinor for a moment, and left. Frowning, Balinor laid a hand on his daughter's shoulder.
"You could come with me. I know you will return to Camelot, but you deserve to know your heritage. Scatheen Dragon sits at the edge of the mountains of Isgard, almost on the border of Camelot and Estir. It'll be an easier journey from there back to Camelot anyway,"
Balinor said, and Merlin frowned, but after a moment she nodded. "I won't be able to stay long," she said, and Balinor nodded.
"I don't intend to stay myself. I simply wish to see what may be left. After that, who knows?"
he said with a slight smile. "Just promise me I won't have to search every cave to find you when you do leave," she said, her tone light. He pulled her into a hug and nodded.
"We'll set out at first light,"
he said with a small smile.